Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a big difference. There's game music and there's film music. And right now they're starting to kind of meld together. Game music I wasn't familiar with in the past because the games that I worked on, they called me up to work on Assassin's Creed Unity as one of the composers for that. And the sound that they wanted was from the Elysium score when I did that film with Neil Blomkamp, that's the sci-fi film. This was, in that score, I brought in orchestra as well. And we recorded that over at Abbey Road in London because I wanted that big sound. But it was never meant to be the focus of the actual score. A lot of electronic elements were that score, including weird animal sounds too, but I felt that the orchestra was going to be needed to help tell the story and to make something feel epic and a little bit larger. And so they wanted the electronic slick sound is what they said for Assassin's Creed. And that was my assignment. Now, Sarah Schachner worked on that as well, and Chris Tilton, another composer. So there were three of us, and they did the majority of the orchestral score, the themes for the characters. I did mostly what's called the Animus, I believe it's called. So they wanted something that was a little bit more otherworldly and something more sci-fi based. Get back, I jumped ahead of myself. The differences between the two. What game music, the goal is a lot, at least that they've been telling me when I've been hired, is to make it cyclical. They want it, when you're playing the game, they want it to build and expand and there's layers that come. But they also want to be able to cut those layers out. And I know that there's new programs coming out with algorithms that have, well, they've already been out for a while, that the computer actually decides based on the player's motives. If they come around a corner and all of a sudden something jumps out, they add the layers and the other ones will get muted. So the computer is deciding on an algorithm based on your decision-making process, what music to pull out and what to keep in. And they're all running simultaneously.
Phantasy Star Online worked with that, didn't they? Where they had like normal music that would play and then like battle music that they would like seamlessly transition to with like, I think it was like 6 or 8 different like points.
It's almost like a mixing engineer just pulling faders all the time, exactly. And the computer's in control of that. So that's kind of where it's headed. And it'll be interesting to see in 10 years if like computers will be actually writing the scores. Because what you can do is you can program a certain amount of melodies and themes, or the computer can come up with their own, putting composers, I don't know, maybe out of business, who knows, and it chooses which ones to play when and where, depending on what level you go into. Bloodborne was cool, on the other hand, because when they called me for Bloodborne, I knew nothing about the project. I hadn't played Dark Souls. I didn't even know what From Software was. So I had to do a little bit of research, but I purposely didn't want to do too much, because I realized that they contacted me being a film composer. They didn't want a game sound maybe necessarily for that. So they wanted maybe something different. So I tried not to listen to too much of what had been done before. And I did a demo for them, and it was very Victorian/Gothic. So I was combining the two Victorian Gothic styles with a mock-up of an orchestra from my computer. And that's the great thing we can do nowadays as composers, is we can bring everything into, I use Logic, some people use Digital Performer, into the computer program, and we can mock it up. Because what they want to do now is they want to hear almost a finished product, unfortunately. I mean, they call John Williams up, and he can just still come up with the themes. Here's E.T. on the piano, and Spielberg's over his shoulder, like, okay, that's going to be awesome, because I know that you're going to do a good job when it translates to the full orchestra. Well, that doesn't really fly anymore unless you have that kind of relationship with a director or a game company. They want to hear almost a finished, polished product, which is a lot of work in case you get rejected as well, because they have a lot of people sending demos. So I hope that in the future that starts to change. And I think that comes directly from the top. In film, it's the studio that's kind of a problem. I don't want to shed a negative light on the studios too much. I'm not sure how the game community works as much, because I've had a little bit more experience in film and television. But we have a lot of executives that are making creative decisions and overruling the directors and their vision. So it becomes a problem where you're trying to please 5, 6, 7 different people, and they're all asking for something different. I had a recent demo that the director really wanted me for the film, and the producer, who's kind of a big power player in Hollywood, came in, had a meeting. He wanted something different, so I was stuck in the middle of the director over here, the producer on this side. He wanted ethereal, he wanted thematic old school, and I didn't know what to give them. Hans Zimmer has a famous quote where he says, the first thing you need to know as a composer is find out who your boss is. Because if you know who you're writing for, you can keep the job and keep moving forward. Because if you don't know who you're going to write for, then you're kind of stuck, right? You need to know what they're looking for. Because it is a business, unfortunately. As much as I'd love to be creative, and all of us composers would love to just spread our wings and do what we feel and what we think makes the story enhanced, you're kind of working for someone who tells you what to do. So if you need 50 different versions of it, you got to give them 50 versions. So, yeah. But don't let that discourage anybody who wants to do film music, because there's a beautiful end of the rainbow where no matter how much you have to go through and how long it takes to get there, when you see it up on screen, even if you're not completely 100% happy with what you did, you know that all these people put a lot of effort in, thousands of people sometimes, and you get to see that, and it's a moment of pride where it's like I helped be a part of something much bigger than myself. And that's why I love film music so much, is because you can go off and write music for yourself, and you can be part of a band too, and the music kind of serves itself. But there's something to me that's magical and it appeals to me when it serves something greater, like a film. And we all know films. I mean, I can't think of any other, or games maybe too, any other type of media that grabs you and puts you in a dark room and has your full attention. You know, films for what, 2-3 hours, where it's like you have to, here's what I'm saying, listen to it, you know? Music, you can turn off the radio, you can turn it on, everyone's got the earphones in. But a film, it's like you can get up and walk out. But I think it's around the world the #1 way of capturing a large audience's attention at one time. So, but anyhow, I came to answer you guys, the questions you guys have. So I've worked on Bloodborne, Assassin's Creed Unity for games, films, Elysium. I worked with Michael Mann on a film called Black Hat, which bombed at the box office because it was the same weekend that American Sniper came out, and everyone went to go see American Sniper. So even though Michael Mann, which is one of my favorite directors, and I was so over the moon when he called me, because he did Last of the Mohicans, which is one of my all-time favorite films. So I jumped at the chance to fly to LA and work with him. Yeah, even though he had a big film, so a big director's name on it, just people didn't show up. And that happens sometimes. You can never guess when a film's going to do well or not. But. So Black Hat, Elysium, I worked a little bit on Chappie. Actually, I wrote a lot of music for Chappie, and I went to Vancouver. And then the director decided that he wanted to go a different direction and called upon Zimmer, who you may or may not have heard of. Probably the most well-known composer right now in the world. And so I had a few additional pieces of music in that, but Zimmer took over that project, like in the middle of it. So those are the projects I've worked on. Actually, you can ask me questions about anything, though. How the process works, anything that appeals to you. Yeah.
You mentioned before about like how things are being selectively muted or whatever for music.
Right.
How do you think artificial intelligence is going to play into that kind of way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, to be honest. I'm reading a book right now about the future of robotics. And it's scary. I mean, this guy he's an editor from Wired magazine who wrote the book, and he's super excited about where it's going, you know, like VR. And a lot of games are becoming in VR now in these rooms. And for me, I'm kind of old school, so it scares me a bit being virtually disconnected from people. But it is cool. There's sites so you can play with someone in Russia or China online, right? And like even have a community that way. So there's definite positives. But if people start locking themselves in bathrooms by themselves with a VR headset, or you know, like I don't know how well that helps humanity move forward. But yeah, artificial intelligence. I think the one job that will stay around, besides cooking, maybe robots can't cook too well. Who knows? Is creative fields. Art, music, because there's something you put into music that humans can put in a soul. I don't know exactly how to quantify that, but you can hear it. I think if a robot, and they've done experiments, maybe we can find it online somewhere, but they've done experiments where robots have written themes, they've written music, and to see if people can tell the difference between a composed piece of music by a person and by a robot. And I think it was 9 out of 10, maybe even all of them could tell a human wrote it, because there's a certain element of, I don't know what it is. I call it the soul. Maybe it's part of your heart that gets put into it that a robot can't quite emulate. But the future of gaming, because there are so many algorithms involved, that'll be the first market, I think, to tilt that way. I think it's just easier, and people want to save money. And if you can save money by not hiring a composer, unfortunately, a lot of business-minded people will take that avenue, and they'll make those shortcuts, you know.
I think that's something you see You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like when a person creates something, it's like it's organic. Like it evolves with the process, and sometimes in the middle of it, you're like, I need to scrap that. I need to change it, or something strikes you. But like when it's a computer making it, they're just pulling from like previous experiences.
Exactly.
It's something there, but like there's it does sound like it's something.
Yeah, I think the more and more I think about it now, as you guys are talking to, I just don't think we can be replaced that much. Musicians in general, I think like a good example was I always think about the Bloodborne score when I was talking. Now, the director of that game, Miyazaki, right? He doesn't speak English, so when we'd have conference calls in Japan, and I was out here just in Virginia where I live in Leesburg, they'd have a panel. I could tell I was on a conference call. And they had a panel of people sitting around and translating for him as he would make comments, and they'd try to translate. And you know, Japanese and English, there's some things that aren't that translatable, especially their art and the way they approach art. So it was interesting. One of the things he had asked for was I'd sent something over, and he said, "Oh, well, it sounds like wet blood. Can we make it sound more like dry blood?" So as a composer or a musician, we have to think, okay, what are they saying, right? Like, how do we translate that into music? Wet versus dry. So those are the kind of fun things that we get to deal with too, is translating what even in English, it's what does a director mean when he wants. Another example was on Elysium, it was on Chappie, where we were going in a more experimental orchestral way at first. I believe the final score that you guys might have heard if you saw the film was more electronically based. We were experimenting more with like weird organic sounds from an orchestra. And Neil had called me up. He said, "Oh, can we do no orchestration?" Now, for a musician or a composer, no orchestration means, that's how you balance the orchestra players, and that's how you're bringing in different elements together to mix in the color, basically, is where you're getting the color from. So I'm thinking orchestration, okay, what is he talking about, And what he had meant, I found out later, like a month later, was no orchestra. Like, I don't want any orchestral instruments. But just learning how to communicate. And this is something that I could have gone back to him and said, I just want to make sure, what did you mean by that, right? Because if I had figured that out a month ahead of time, it would have saved a ton of trouble. Because I didn't know what he was looking for at that point.
There is one other thing I want to bring up. Do you think it would benefit more amateur game designers who are trying to break into the industry to have this like procedurally generated electronic music, because it could help them like take an extra step and have something that's more like fillery? Because currently a lot of people just buy like cheap music packs when they don't have like much to work with. They just kind of like it as a placeholder. But having something that's like you can just plug it in and get something out that vaguely fits what you're going for. Do you think that would be like more helpful in the long run? Step up?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I keep thinking back to the Bloodborne game because they spent a lot of money on that score. And funny enough, I didn't know that they were Japanese composers that were in-house at From Software. I found out after we flew to London to record the full orchestra and choir, that there were other composers that had written other pieces of music. And I started to panic thinking, because they had come to me for the theme. And I thought, well, what did these other guys do? Because what if it's completely different and it doesn't fit the world? But I found out later that they had listened to my approach, and everyone had signed off on it. And so they had taken that and done their own version of it as Japanese composers with a completely different approach to music, and it worked beautifully. Like, I actually liked their approach and the style. They view music much differently than Hollywood and from Western music, and it brings a really refreshing sound, I think. And From Software decided to make that call. They didn't have to spend all the money to go record. Orchestras cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to record. So for someone to put in that kind of money means that they really want to elevate their game. Have you guys played Bloodborne at all, or one of Dark Souls or anything?
Yeah.
Did you like the game?
Oh yeah.
Did you like the atmosphere they set up? Because I know that From Software is known for creating a very silent atmosphere.
It's interesting how it's like dark and dreary like the other games, but like the way that it's just set up feels so different. Because with Dark Souls, usually what you have is like imposing figures in this sort of like almost like ha 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 kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
It's just like imposing on you, and you have this monumental task to come over. But with like in Bloodborne, there's this kind of like you're still within civilization. It's like there's something attacking from outside that's clashing with what's the normal of this universe, and you're basically trying to like protect it. So it's kind of like a scrappy kind of like you're where you belong, but things that don't belong are here now, and you have to deal with it.
Were you guys aware of the music when you were playing at all during the fights?
Oh yeah.
Because they get pretty intense. They sent me one of the battles to work on, and I think it was Father Gascoigne. And so they just give it to they just give it to us with no music, and it's like, well, what would you do here? So it's very different than a film too, because a film, what you're doing is you're turning corners as the characters. Like say Lord of the Rings is a good example compared to fighting that style. And someone misses, and you'll make a corner when the bad guy's coming from behind you, and then it tapers off to this. So in games, you don't have that control because as a composer, we're not in control of what the player is doing. So I had no clue how to approach it at first, and I actually approached it as a film score. So when I wrote it, I had no clue what the player might be doing. It's like, well, I don't want him to get bored, so it's got to go somewhere, but then it's got to somehow cycle back on itself. So I had to learn really quickly how game music works. And even that game, I think, is different than a lot of other games because it takes a different approach to the music. It's not right in your face usually. It's kind of in the back until you're forced to kind of confront it.
And not just that, the way that the game flow changes, because most games are like very immediate, or they take a long time to get to something, and it's really obvious. But those games are just so methodical in their movement that it kind of translates to the music too. So if there's a sort of background symphony kind of going on, it melds really well with the character actions because there's this kind of flow to the movement where it can fit with those things.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of games?
Really well.
What kind of games do you guys like to play? What are some of your favorite games? Even back to when you were kids.
I'm really partial to RPGs.
Okay.
In general, and usually some of the musicians I think of, my personal favorite when it comes to game music is Yuzo Koshiro.
Okay.
And he's done so much.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're absolutely fantastic. And their kind of thing is, and this is what I'm used to seeing in RPGs, is exactly what you're talking about. You have to kind of capture this generalist tone, and it's really hard with RPGs because usually one or two battle themes are used throughout the entire game.
Mhm.
So you're not necessarily composing just for that particular fight. You're composing for the general theme of the game and how those fights are going to happen throughout most of everything except for boss battles. So yeah.
And do most boss battles, because you guys probably play a lot more games than I do they usually have their own thematic? Each character has a different theme? Yeah.
Usually if they're super important, they'll bust out something new, and you're just oh, this person's very important because this is not the normal battle music. So now I'm really in for something.
So it does inform the player a lot.
Yeah.
Very cool. And do you guys prefer, I guess it depends on the type of game, but there's electronic scores that have done very well, and then there's more orchestral scores for some of these big AAA games as well. I mean, does it depend on the game, or do you guys prefer?
So it does depend on the game.
It depends.
Because there's Doom, where there isn't as much, pure metal stuff.
Uh-huh.
They do introduce some orchestral stuff, whatever.
Mhm.
And Mick Gordon, I read one of his Reddit things. I think it's the director said we need more guitar or something like that. He's like, but what if I do this?
Ah.
And I really like that pitch.
So there's a good example where the composer can give ideas, and the director might take it and never thought of it before, which is a nice creative collaboration there.
Yeah, because I know that for Doom they had the GDC talk, and they had it where he was trying to make a brand new sound, so he ran it through multiple audio monitors, shooting out sound at the same time in order to create something completely brand new.
Cool.
But the one thing that was missing, because at first he was told not to use any guitar whatsoever, was the guitar, because that's what the old soundtrack used. So he wanted to bring that back, but mix it with the new sound in a way that was completely fresh and new.
That's a cool idea, yeah. Sometimes you can get that past a director too. I've heard stories of people writing tracks that they like, they send it to the director's in a bad mood that day or something. No, I don't like it. Get rid of it. So they just wait a week. They submit the same exact piece of music, haven't changed a thing, and they love it the next week. This happens sometimes. So they're creatives, right? Creative people have these mood swings, and sometimes they, it depends on what day it is. So that's cool. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your, I guess just how you you get from Wisconsin to Louisiana?
That was very, very fortunate. To be honest, I started, so from music school, there was a competition I found out about. Because I wasn't sure, you're in Minneapolis, and there's a music scene there, but not for film, really. And I knew I wanted to do film music because I grew up loving it. And there was a competition that was put on by BMI called the Pete Carpenter Fellowship. And it was through Mike Post. Mike Post, for anyone who's older, would know him from the A-Team theme, Doogie Howser. He did a lot of themes for TV shows. They're very popular. And he still does Law & Order, I think. He's getting up there. He must be like 80 now. But yeah, he's still doing music for TV for the Law & Order series. But what he does is he does a fellowship every year. I think he still does it in honor of his friend Pete Carpenter, who passed away back in the, I think, early 90s, it might have been, mid-90s. And so he'll bring 2 or 3 people out to LA to mentor them. And they get to go out and study with him a little bit, watch him in his studio score the TV shows. And so I thought, well, this sounds awesome, right? Why not give it a shot? So lesson number 1 is never think that you're not capable of doing something. Send out to competitions, like enter anything you want to, because you just never know. And they ended up calling me back for it, and I was fortunate to be one of the 2 people that was selected that year to go out and work with Mike Post for a few weeks. So that was kind of my foot into the industry, because once you meet people, then they start to recommend you to other people. The funny thing is he recommended me to a composer, Snuffy Walden was his name, and he worked on some TV shows too. I can't remember which ones back in the 90s, but it was a really nice thing that he recommended me. I missed the meeting because I went to the wrong restaurant. Yeah, so that wasn't meant to be. And they never returned my phone call again when I tried to call the secretary and reschedule. So things like that happen. But after that, I decided to move to LA. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to pack up everything in my car that I own. And I just drove out to LA from Wisconsin one winter. And I knew one person, Mike Post. So I thought, well, that might help. And I went out there, and I met with the director of BMI. If anyone knows who BMI ASCAP is, they do a lot to help composers in the community, and that's how we get paid for our royalties as well. And she knew of a composer that was living in North LA, or north of LA, that was doing reality TV stuff. And lo and behold, they needed an assistant. Would you mind, give him a call? So I'm like, okay, great. And I think at that time I was working in Burbank at the IKEA. So I was holding down whatever jobs I could out in LA just to make ends meet, and still doing music at night on the side, trying to put together demos. So if you can get demos together, that's a good thing to do too. And this is way before we had a lot of social media stuff, so you couldn't meet people really that way. So yeah, I had an interview, and they thought that I was far enough along in my computer skills and my composition skills to, they took me on as an assistant. And at that point, they were doing The Apprentice, and they had just signed on to The Biggest Loser, which I don't know if it's still is it still running? Anyone has seen it? It went for like 13 or 14 seasons or something crazy.
It's one of those things that it's just like one of those like very straightforward, simple concepts that they can just watch.
Oh yeah, they just keep bringing people in, and so. But I was excited at that point. It's reality TV. It was my first gig, and I got my music on TV that way. And it was awful music. I remember I listened back to it now, and it wasn't mixed well. It was like I didn't have the great sounding samples. So it was, you could just tell, and it was like season 1 was awful. But they didn't fire me, they kept me on. And so I stayed there, and I helped hire the next guy that came in, who were like best friends now. You guys, maybe you know about Mark Petrie. He does a lot of, I think he worked on the Madden game a couple years ago, NFL Madden, and he does a lot of trailer music now. But yeah, so that's how I started in TV. Well, they decided to change their whole way of paying us, and decided basically not to pay us anymore, and they would keep most of the royalties, and they would just give us a small salary. And I guess I'm one of those weird people that does risky things. It's good to take risks sometimes. So I quit, having nothing else to know where to go. And I decided to write my own trailer music. And I thought, trailer music is more interesting to me because it brings in the orchestra, which I loved. So it was a nice bridge, I thought. I didn't know anyone in film. And so I started writing trailer music for other companies. And I got a few trailers out there. It didn't pay a whole lot, but it was, I was making ends meet still, again, just doing music professionally. And then I moved to Bolivia, So this is what not, you would say this is what not to do if you want to make it in Hollywood, is move to South America, right? But I had just gotten married. My wife's from Bolivia, and I wanted to go down there. She practiced law. So moved to Bolivia. Long story short, I started my own trailer company from there. Now, this is a country where we get blackouts like every day. And there's no internet service for most of the houses there. Maybe 10% of people have internet. So I had to write music and hook up my own studio there in a bedroom. And I had the samples. So I had the good sounding samples I had invested in. I had to go downtown in the city with a USB drive to actually upload and send the music to the companies in LA. And it would take a half an hour for one track to like be mailed to them. So it was a nightmare. But I started my own trailer company called City of the Fallen. And that one actually went on to, someone selected, I think was it Disney? Someone selected one of my tracks to put in the first Avengers trailer. So that got selected for an international trailer for the Avengers. So I had made all my money back that I invested in that, but it could have easily failed. So another thing that was just fortunate for me. But those things don't happen unless you put yourself out there and try, right? Like, what can you do from South America? Well, I did what I could with what I had, and it just worked out, fortunately, if that can be an encouragement to anyone. But the film thing didn't happen until somebody started putting my trailer music up on YouTube. To this day, I don't know who it was because they would just grab music and just throw it up there for different things. And lo and behold, the director of District 9, Neil Blomkamp, heard my music in some YouTube video or trailer that I didn't even know about. And he emailed me from it. And he wanted, is this your music? And I didn't know who Neil Blomkamp was. I had seen District 9 actually while I was living in Bolivia, but I didn't know the director's name. And so he wanted to talk with me, and I'm thinking, oh, hell yeah, give me a call. And he's like, where are you? I'm like, well, I'm in Bolivia. He's like, what the hell are you doing in Bolivia? Well, I'm married, and I explained the whole thing. He's like, well, that's okay, I don't care. He's like, let's get on the phone and do like a Skype or something. So we did a Skype, and he got to see me, and he basically just wanted to know, what kind of music do you like? What kind of movies do you like? We didn't know anything about each other. And I guess I had answered his questions well enough for him to hire me. Now, granted, I had never worked on a film before, hadn't worked on any games, really nothing except reality TV and some trailer music up to that point. But it takes directors like him or creative people to just say, screw it, I don't care the system, And when I tell people about that story later, they're like, well, that's impossible, it doesn't work. Every agent I've ever talked to says, no, it doesn't happen. So I'm walking proof that it does happen. So if you get a chance, get your music out on YouTube, put it on any social media channel you can. You just don't know who's listening. And I did well enough, I guess, on that film not to be replaced. Because I found out after the fact that a lot of people didn't want me there, who's this kid, who has no experience, But I stayed till the end, and the film came out, and it did well. It made its money back. It wasn't a big hit and stuff, but and I met some people that way. But to be honest, since then, it hasn't been, I didn't stay in Hollywood. I didn't move to Hollywood. I stayed here. I like it in Virginia. My family loves it. The schools are great. So it hasn't been as easy to find work out here. You can fly back and forth to LA, but if you want to be in film, games are different. Games are from all over the world. Trailers are the same way. You can basically go anywhere. There are a lot of games based, though, in California, San Francisco area, LA. And a lot of people do move out there. And if you've got no ties and you want to take the risks, I'd say do it. I moved to LA to get involved because there's just so many opportunities to be an assistant. And when you're an assistant to somebody who's like a big composer, or you see how their process works. And you'll see directors and producers and people come into the studio and have meetings. And sometimes it's just important to learn how they talk to each other. How do you talk to a director? What are the things that you ask them? What are the things that, and you learn that way from the ground up. So even though I didn't do it that way, and I still haven't moved to LA because I like it, move to LA if you want to be a composer, at least for a while, like give it a shot. And give it a couple years. It doesn't happen automatically. So did that help answer at all kind of how, yeah, it was a really weird way. I didn't go up through the system at all. And I feel much more like a George Lucas, where he loathes Hollywood. And that's why he set up his own place up in, near the San Francisco area. And I feel like that too. If I could set up my own and just stay here and then fly out there once in a while to do films, I would do it. And I'm trying from here, so we'll see what happens. But I think so. Does anybody lived in LA at all for a while or been out there? And Oh, I shouldn't talk bad about LA. It's a little intense. It's just the traffic.
In San Francisco, and that was like a long.
Was it? We did the Bloodborne trailer in San Francisco, so I've only been there once, but I could kind of feel the same vibe there. It's an energy. You definitely get an energy being around all of these people who do that for a living. But there's so much, I hate to use the word arrogance, there's a lot of egos out there that are hard to deal with. And if you can avoid that, it's always best. I think it's Michael Giacchino that would always say, and you guys know him as a composer, Michael Giacchino, The Lost, Doctor Strange. I mean, just every big blockbuster you can think of has his name on it. But he told me, he's like, just work with people that you like. And of course, when you're in his position and he gets all these things and he's rejecting 90% of the films, he can say that. But I think he's right. Work with people that are nice, that are friendly, that you want to hang out with. Because it's really too short to work with jerks. Do it once, do it twice if you have to, but just try to keep them at arm's length if you can. Yeah.
And that's how creativity works. You kind of feed on your own positivity, at least in some way, right?
Yeah, the best scenario is when you're working with someone who you're friends with. And you guys, it's a mutual respect where you're throwing ideas around, almost like you're kids in someone's basement. Kind of, let's make a film with our little video camera. It should be fun. And if it's not fun, then why are you doing it? There's a wolf that just went past the window. A wolf head. There's some mascot says video. Okay, sorry, that will freak me out. Well, any other questions you guys have? Yeah.
A little bit of an odd one. So, as far as you were asking games that I can play and everything, play a lot of RPGs, so a lot of the games that I listen to have a lot more melodic type music to them. Nobuo Uematsu from the Final Fantasy series, Hitoshi Sakamoto, the Toy Sakuraba, a lot more melodic type stuff like that. I notice if you're looking at films that are older, say 50s, 60s, even the 70s a little bit, you have more melodic themes throughout them, and then that kind of went away. And I'm seeing it come a little bit back in some the Marvel stuff. Do you think the pendulum's ever going to swing that way, or should we just get used to writing atmospheric stuff?
Oh man, I'm praying that it swings back. I know not everyone would agree with me because some people like that atmospheric stuff, And I think the problem that's happening with atmospheric music is because it doesn't say anything to you. We call it wallpaper in the industry. It just sits there in the back of the room, right? And it doesn't tell you anything. And I think a lot of the style that film and games are going, I think it's a fad, but they're going where they don't want you to know what to feel right away. It's like you're kind of on your own. Christopher Nolan loves this. His films are gray. Look at the colors that they're using. I mean, it's gray, it's matted, there's not bright colors in his films, and the music reflects that too. It's not that Hans Zimmer can't write a theme. You guys heard Crimson Tide? The Lion King? The guy's great. It's just, that's not what Christopher Nolan is asking of him. And he might have alone with the Dark Knight trilogies kind of started, or the Batman, I always think of the Dark Knight because that's his opus, right? He kind of started this more darker, especially with the superhero stuff. And I feel they're trying to bring it back and lighten it up a little bit because it's so heavy and it's so sometimes claustrophobic. I think the atmospheric, to answer your question, will stay around for a little bit longer just because that's the type of films people are making. And if you all of a sudden bring in the swashbuckling music, they'll be like, whoa. And the producers are a part of the problem. They're like, no, this formula worked, right? Christopher Nolan had a hit movie and made all this money. Well, we want to make a return on our investment. So let's just copy that formula. But it's happening with Marvel films too, where you can interchange any of them. And I feel like Elysium was a little bit of that. I remember being a little disappointed that they didn't want something more creative because we had ideas and then he went back to just copy Batman. Or it's well, that's already been done, but the formula worked and people feel safe that way. They're not going to lose money with some weird experimental score. But I think the older films used to experiment a lot, and that's what made them classics. I don't know. I haven't seen any classics, I feel, that have come out of Hollywood lately. Maybe I could be wrong, but I used to buy a ton of film scores, and I used to buy just a lot of movies to watch and add to my collection. And I think in the past 3 or 4 years, I've bought one. I think I bought The Revenant, which was an atmosphere score, right? So I guess it depends on the film, but I hope it swings back. And I think if history is any indication, I think it will. It might just take a few years to get back there.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry.
Someone over there?
He had his hand up here for a second.
So, I heard you talk about atmospheric music in relation to modern film.
Yeah.
A good example of the utilization starring Jared Leto, where they used Eric Sasse's Genevieve number 3 during one of the films. It was a very sort of solemn portion of the film where he's photographing plants as they sort of withered and died. And I feel like maybe a return to that particular portion of atmospheric contemporary music would be really helpful in revitalizing film scores in general. Because although they may be sort of off-putting in a sense, and they may not be as attractive as very common film scores, they allow for a more impactful sort of, I guess, emotionally evocative scene than what we usually see in modern film, because a lot of it is very bland on the surface and doesn't allow for that evocation of emotion that you would get from films even in the early 2000s. That's just sort of my personal view, but if you feel differently, that's also respectable and understandable.
I didn't get a chance to see that film, unfortunately, but this is the beautiful thing about music, is it's so subjective. You could try to replace, say, those Batman scores with something different that maybe had a little bit more thematic material besides, a chord transition, and maybe it wouldn't have worked as well. Because we do, as composers, we do try to throw things up and see if they stick against the screen. Ultimately, it's the director's decision. But Elysium, we tried everything. I mean, I had melodic stuff, thematic stuff. I had nothing but like a drone and they end up liking the drone stuff a little bit more. And this real bass heavy, and they loved percussion. So percussion, this is another thing I was thinking about, action writing. I think what happened I don't know how it affects games as much, but they used to write action music in the Jerry Goldsmith era, where I think what they were doing was they were scoring the mind of the protagonist, or the person that, say, you're running down the street chasing somebody. They were scoring what was going through the head of the character. Now what's happening is it's pulse-based, it's rhythmic-based, right? So I think what's shifted is now they're scoring the actual heartbeat. I think they're trying to bring in this anxiety heartbeat kind of pulse, and that's where they're getting that from. It plays differently, right? It just, and who's to say which one works better or worse? We all have different opinions, right? But
yeah. That actually ties into what I was about to ask. Why do you think they shifted to this more like trying to catch the audience, I'm not saying this in like a negative way, but not like manipulate their emotions in such a way with these themes, and going away from the way they used to do it before, where it was like powerful character themes that you would mix in with like the wallpapery more music. Because like you mentioned, you used to buy soundtracks.
Yeah.
You would think like, I remember that theme from like the Titanic soundtrack was huge.
Yeah.
It had like that one theme, but you don't really see like a headliner theme anymore. Do you know why that is? Like why it's shifted?
So it's like almost like the difference between a recognizable theme, something that you can associate with something. It's the difference between association and almost just sort of like losing yourself in the theme itself. It's sort of like it's immersion versus association.
Well, I get that. I was just wondering, like from your experience, like, because you said that directors are specifically going for certain things, and producers are going for certain things. What's your experience?
A lot of it, if you're talking about the business side of things where these producers and executives are making decisions, which unfortunately is the case right now, they see it as old-fashioned. I think sometimes the people I've talked to, it's just as simple as that. They're like, oh, it sounds old-fashioned. It's an orchestra. And so what composers are trying to do, because we know the power that it can have of when you leave the theater and you're still humming a theme. I mean, there's something magical about it, and it's fantastical, if I can use that word. And because they're making films now that are more reality-based, where they don't want you to be like coming out like, oh, it's spectacular and we're all floating on clouds and we're happy and we're singing the melodies. It's more like we want to feel like we're inside of that character's mind, and anything else is going to distract from that. The problem is reality is becoming so dark to some people. I mean, I don't know what, let's say, like the suicide rate is, right? I just don't know how that relates to entertainment and how strong of a connection there is, where like these movies that are coming out they can be artistic, but they can be pretty bleak. When before we were growing up, we had these fun, magical type of movies, and the music had a lot to do with that. And you would feel a little bit more uplifted. And it's a completely different kind of story they're telling. So I think what's happening now is they're just trying to tell stories that are a little bit more morose in a way. And I think the music reflects that exactly. It's the film was the horse and the music became the cart to it a little bit. And bringing that back is kind of, you're fighting against the system. It'll take one big epic with a great big score again. I mean, because Star Wars, did you guys see Solo at all?
That's the only one I haven't seen.
They brought back a big score again. Now, they did use some themes that John Williams wrote again and brought in, but John Powell did that score. John Powell's an incredible composer, and he knows how to do both. He can do the stuff from like Jason Bourne, which is a little bit more subdued and rhythmic, and he can do the big orchestral stuff. So it pays to be a chameleon as well. But unless more of those big epic ones come out again, like Dances with Wolves, those type of films are being made, and they want this romantic idealization of the story, then it'll kick in. Because when something gets popular in Hollywood, everyone wants to copy it immediately. Exactly. That's what happens.
Probably like 5 or 10 years, you think, is probably what we're talking about, like to maybe even see a glimmer of a
Yeah, maybe 5 years from now, we might start seeing it turn a little bit. But it depends on the movies that are being made. If someone will go make these epics, they're just too expensive to make anymore. I think Dances with Wolves was made for $30 million, I want to say, which today with inflation that might equate to like 80 to 100. Well, these superhero movies with all the effects, I mean, if you look at the effects artists on these films, I mean, there's thousands. And that's where all the money's going. But they say it's still cheaper to do things with green screens than to go out and get a whole battle scene with a bunch of real horses and people. So until that switches, Game of Thrones is kind of a game changer, I think, a little bit. It's not super orchestral. They're still keeping it minimal. It's not these huge things, but they're bringing in real instruments. And the production quality now is rivaling any type of film you see. So they put a lot of money into those. And maybe TV's edging out film. I mean, look at HBO. People would rather sit at home and watch the series than maybe pay for a ticket to the cinema. That's happening.
So maybe it's almost like the establishment of the cinematic motif that we previously had. Because
It is.
there was a motif among films previously, like you were mentioning, where it was sort of epic. It was sort of like this, very much when it came to an apex. Whereas any longer it's subdued, almost depressing in a sense.
Yeah. So if the films come out and they're more lighthearted, we'll see a change. Now, you do see orchestral scores with comedies still. They'll bring that in. The marimba is a popular choice if it's an independent. There's these stereotypes that keep coming back in for a reason. It's because they work, and people know the formula works, and they keep bringing them back. But it would be nice to hear a little bit more refreshing stuff. I love what Johnny Greenwood does in like There Will Be Blood or movies like that, where he's bringing in a very organic a violin or a cello, an instrument, but he's writing the score in a way that it still gives us an atmospheric feel, but it's completely live instrumentation. So that's kind of becoming popular now too. They're calling it neoclassical. I had someone ask me for neoclassical music, and I was trying to make sense of what that is because it's such a broad range of, Yeah, so you kind of have to guess. But so that's helping things move a little bit back into the orchestra. The great thing about orchestras is that it's keeping them in business. When they do these films, these concerts where you do the performance of the orchestra to the film, the players get to keep performing. And sadly, I know Hans Zimmer is a big advocate of trying to keep orchestras financed because they were disappearing for a while. So there's a resurgence now of the orchestra playing film scores. Happens to be film scores that are old, and it happens to be film scores that are big melodic scores, because I think that's what people want to go when they go get away and listen to an orchestra. I mean, imagine like a drone score, like sitting there listening to it live on stage, everyone would be asleep within 10 minutes. So, yeah.
I noticed that there's a bit of resurgence, well, not necessarily resurgence, but like a surgence, like initial, of like game concerts outside of like Japan.
Yes.
Where you're starting to see it, like even at the National Harbor, they have like video game music concerts.
Yeah.
Like, orchestras there, and it's interesting to see that pop up in general.
Yeah, and they're taking old scores like that were synth based, right? Like Mario Brothers and stuff, and they're doing a version that's orchestral, and people love it. So that's helping too when those are coming back in. It's actually really big in Europe too. Europe seems to be kind of at the forefront of a lot of this stuff. Yeah. I think it's because their culture, if you look at their history of a lot of these European countries, it's in the arts. America's always been a business culture, unfortunately. We just don't have that pinnacle of the arts sometimes. And Hollywood's based there. But Hollywood was formed by a lot of immigrants that came and formed Hollywood, which were great artists and musicians from Europe usually, so yeah.
So what is your opinion on maybe as far as like a more uplifting sound? I always think of when we move back to tango, which has that sort of like emotional spectrum there. It can go anywhere from like a very sort of sad and somber sound with its cadence to a very sort of uplifting and sort years old is what I think of tango.
Okay.
And I'm thinking maybe like if we start leaning more towards maybe something more of a standard Latina like sourced instrumentation, maybe it's we could potentially look at a resurgence of like more uplifting sounds.
Yeah, that's true. I wish my wife was here. She could talk to you about gypsy music all day. She loves gypsy music from Spain. I mean, it's just incredible the way that it's played. And living in Bolivia, I got to see a lot of instrumental music come that has panpipes, and it's the beautiful thing too about film music and game music now that it's such a universal thing that my favorite thing to do is to bring in instruments from all over the world. I collect them. I try to collect them, and I bring them in, and I think, how can I use this instrument, but not in its traditional use, but in a way that, what does that sound like? Like a dilruba, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a Middle Eastern. It's just these, or what's a bansuri, or some of these instruments that I can't even play myself, but you can bring in a soloist, and you can filter it. Like you were mentioning before, like sometimes you can run a guitar through a lot of different pedals. You can run a violin through pedals. You can run any instrument you want, a Chinese instrument through a bunch of different pedals, and it's going to sound like nothing you've ever heard before. And I like that kind of experimentation. And I think that games, more than film, are allowing that. They're allowing composers to experiment that way. So there is a lot to be said for game music where you have a much broader palette to work with, and they're not as confining in what you can do creatively.
So it acts as like almost the foreground for experimentation.
Yeah.
Whereas film is almost like this sort of like, after the experimentation has occurred, this is sort of like the result that we can push out to the mainstream.
Yeah, it's almost like games throw away the formula a little bit more. Where Hollywood's too scared to try something new, games will be like, experiment, like find something. And sometimes the weirder it is, the more they love it. And that helps a lot with, and maybe that will start to spill over. Because games and film, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, I feel like they're merging. Even the new Avatar films coming out, James Cameron talks about wanting this 3D experience without glasses. And he's keeping it very under wraps. So we don't know what he's planning to do of how to immerse yourself in the world of Pandora without having to put glasses on. And it's a new technology they're working on, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. No pun intended. But yeah. We could see it sooner than I think. I mean, it could take place like that. I'm thinking maybe 5 years, things will start to turn around with orchestral music coming back, but it could be sooner. I know this is a huge, broad topic because we're trying to cover like TV, games, film, everything. But if you guys have any other questions you have for me, I'll take them.
So as far as like genre blending and instrumentation blending, how likely do you think we are to see that in film at the moment? Because the only example I can think of in video games is a guy named Jake Kaufman, who worked on the Shovel Knight series, and in his instrumentation from the original NES, he has all sorts of like waltzes, classical, you name it, like all in that package. So
Cool.
I don't know if you see the same thing coming forward to the film industry.
And it's not incidental music, it's not source, it's the actual score, the background music?
Yes.
That's really cool. So I didn't even know people were getting to do that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big impact. I think that'll make a big impact on film. I think what's going to happen, I know we had talked about Neil Blomkamp giving me my first opportunity. He is also trying a lot of things with game engines. I think it's called Steam. Does that sound familiar to you guys? So he's trying this new, I don't know anything about it, so I can't talk about it, but I think he's trying to integrate that a little bit more, where the character, I think they're even trying films now where the character, VR films, can be, you're actually in the film controlling how you respond to the story. Now the story's not changing, you're just kind of a part of it now. So imagine Lord of the Rings, you're like one of the orcs, like running at the castle or something. I mean, that could be an immersive experience that everyone would really get involved in. And that could be where we see that complete merging of the game world. So it's in a kind of an exciting time for that, to see what comes out of it, if they do it right.
Does it sound remarkably similar to certain like Japanese RPGs where what they do is there's like a protagonist character, but they're basically nothing more than a viewpoint character because they're like really flat and just something for like the viewer to project onto. So that sounds like something that'll lend well to what you just.
Yeah, it does actually. I hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah.
That sounds cool.
I feel like an interesting jump off of your point would be talking about what, from games versus films, if there's some
I see what you mean. Because in a film, what you're doing is you're trying to weave everything together, and sometimes these themes that you write musically will weave together with the same instrumentation. Is that what you're talking about? But in games, you can actually shift gears completely if you go to a different level or you enter. I think it was Bloodborne was an example where there's one part we enter where we just wrote a choir piece that was basically like a chant. I don't remember what part of it, but it's not an orchestral piece at all, besides being voices. But it's a complete spin-off, and you wouldn't be able to do that as easily in a film, because in film you want that cohesive singularity that tells the story.
Yeah, that tends to be one of the advantages in gaming is you can get to a certain point where like they can defy like what you expect, but in a way where it doesn't it's not as jarring as in a film because the film's like so. But like you mentioned, there's just kind of like a flow over. It's just straightforward, and you have like the plot arc and everything. But since you have the freedom of movement in the game, I guess people are more receptive to sudden tone shifts or walking into a place and being like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here. While like in a movie, if you walk into a place where it feels like you shouldn't be here, the director or the writer took you that route. So you're just like, hey, what's going on up there? Like, why are we driving to this weird area?
Yeah.
It relates to time available too, because those tonal shifts, like if you were to go ahead and create a theme that is repeated throughout a game, you don't have to return to it as quickly.
That's true.
As you do in a film, I should say. Because in a film, you have maybe 2 to 3 hours, and you have to keep returning to a theme to keep the consistency. Whereas a game, you can shift off of that sort of sonic theme for anywhere from 2 to 3 hours in a game and not lose the consistency of feel of the game, or not sort of throw you off so far that you can't continuously perceive what's occurring. Whereas with a film, if you shift off for more than like 20 or 30 minutes, then you're shifting the entire theme or the entire sort of feel of
Yeah.
the film itself.
I'm interested in how that applies to short games, but I think definitely the fact that the player is temporally self-directed most of the time, unless you're in some sort of on-rails or political situation, that ties into that as well. By the way, is it helpful for you if we all move up a bit?
Oh no, it's good. Actually, I just got the time signal for me, so I think my time is pretty much up here. But if anybody wants to ask one more question at all before I... No? Cool. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, it's great. I know my background's more in film than games, but so I'm learning more about games just being here too. Oh, yeah.
Social media, like you have a Twitter?
Oh, well, I've got a website. I joined Twitter. See, I'm in this weird, straddling the fence. I'm old school, but then I'm trying to stay also with the new technology, so I'm kind of right in the middle. So I finally got a Twitter thing, but I don't really go on it much. I can write it down for you guys if you want to come up and grab it. I'm on Facebook, Ryan Ammon. I've got a website, ryanAmmon.com. You can email me directly through it. I mean, I've got my email right there, so it's pretty easy to get a hold of me if you want.
Do you already have a panel in Supermag?
I'm sorry?
Do you already have a panel in Supermag? Or
No. This is the first time I've spoken since Elysium came out. I did Q&A after a screening of the film in Hollywood. So yeah, I don't do this a whole lot because I'm not used to being up in front of people. But
I think you did a good job.
no, thanks, man.
If you can get a panel in Supermag or even MAGLabs next year, I think it would be great because the conversation that's been sparked is really, really engaging.
Yeah. And no, I'd love to. And by next year, who knows where gaming's going to be.